Now you will hear the real sound from the surface of Mars. This is not music, not some kind of reconstructed sound. This is a real recording made by the NASA rover right on its surface. And the creepiest thing about it is the absolute emptiness, because when you realize that this sound came from another planet, the feeling becomes very strange.
The Red Planet attracts not only writers and science fiction fans, but also scientists. Over time, a huge number of spacecraft have studied it. And today we'll learn the story of one of them, the Mars Rover Opportunity. What did Opportunity have to face on its journey? And what does the surface of Mars look like through the lens of the rover's camera? Opportunity began its mission on July 7, 2003. The rover's launch vehicle was the Delta II rocket, which on January 25, 2004, approached the Red Planet itself and entered its atmosphere. As the spacecraft descended to the surface, a parachute was deployed to reduce the speed of descent. When it was almost at the surface, it stopped its descent using 3 rocket engines. After that, the rover separated from the carrier rocket and landed on the planet. In this image, you can see the marks left by the rocket engines. During landing, Opportunity ended up in the Eagle crater. The crater was small, 22 meters deep, and the rover was not in any danger. Nevertheless, landing the spacecraft in a crater was not part of the scientists' plans, and the rover was given the nickname Hole-in-One in honor of the successful landing. This event could also be seen as the crater's discovery, since researchers were previously unaware of it. In general, Opportunity deviated from its landing site by about 25 meters. The change in the landing site also happened because the spacecraft had protection in the form of special airbags. Because of this, the rover simply bounced off the surface. After Opportunity got rid of its protection, it was able to activate its solar panels. The rover was also equipped with a camera that was capable of taking panoramic images. And the first photo taken by the device shows outcrops of rocks on the surface of the planet. Throughout its mission, Opportunity focused on studying geological structures, as they could provide more information about the early stages of Mars's formation. It took Opportunity several weeks to study the discovered area. It turned out that this cluster of rocks had traces indicating the action of a liquid. What exactly was this liquid? At this point, it was not possible to determine. It could be either water or lava. After 30 days, the device moved to another part of this relief formation, drilled into one of the rocks, and captured the spot with its camera. As a result, a formation was found that occurs when mineral substances fill voids in various rocks. This is also called a geode. During the research, it was found that the stone contains hydroxide ions. This means that at the moment the stone was formed, it was affected by water. One of Opportunity's wheels dug a trench on the surface to study the properties and composition of Martian soil. As a result, a kind of pit was formed about 15 centimeters deep and about a meter long. Scientists discovered a formation beneath the top layer that they call blueberries. The nature of their origin is currently unknown. It's also worth paying attention to the tiny grains of sand, which the rover wasn't able to examine in detail because its camera wasn't designed for such small objects. It took the Opportunity rover several weeks to study this area. After completing this stage of its mission, the rover moved on. The rover approached another crater, which was later named Endurance. Its width is about 200 meters. On the way to this formation, the rover encountered another interesting, though small, crater called Fram. Opportunity did not stay here for long, but we did receive several images from it. So the spacecraft reached Endurance Crater. The rover made it possible to observe a cluster of rocks that had come to the surface. Then, the spacecraft began its descent into the crater. It was necessary to choose a place where it would be possible not only to go down, but also to come back up. This caused some difficulties. The Mars rover circled half the crater but still couldn't find a suitable spot. The scientists eventually decided where the rover would descend. At the same time, there was a chance that Opportunity would remain in the crater forever. However, the task of studying this formation was more important than preserving the Mars rover. When it started to descend upon reaching the middle, it began to roll back. He managed to do it without any problems. That means the vehicle could have left the crater. That's how Opportunity began its descent. The rover stayed inside the crater for 180 days. It studied the rocks that had come to the surface. It was decided not to send the rover to the very center, where the dunes were located. It would have been much more difficult to move there. Accordingly, the probability that the rover would get stuck there would have been high. In the materials provided by Opportunity, you can see a cracked stone that was named Wap May. This boulder was lying on the surface at an angle, and its top layer was quite loose. Unfortunately, because of these factors, Opportunity was not able to study the materials that made up this stone. Around the same time the rover was studying the boulder, it captured a view of the Martian sky. 315 days after the mission began, Opportunity provided a panoramic image of Burns Cliff. This was the last thing the rover did while it was in the crater. Next, the spacecraft began approaching the place where the heat shield debris had fallen. Opportunity started studying them. The rover also discovered a meteorite, which became the first of its kind found anywhere but Earth. Next, the spacecraft was supposed to study another meteorite, which was named Erebus, after the eternal darkness in ancient Greek myths. Unfortunately, on its way there, on the 445th day of its stay on Mars, the Opportunity rover got stuck because it was traveling in an area with sand dunes about 30 meters high. To resolve this unpleasant situation, it was decided to increase the speed of the rover. Unfortunately, this did not yield any results. In fact, quite the opposite. The rover got even more stuck in the sand. It was necessary to find an effective solution to keep the rover operational. To do this, scientists recreated the situation in laboratory conditions using a replica of the rover and the right amount of sand. It took 20 days to find a solution. Then the scientists decided to move the rover forward by small distances over the next 20 days. To monitor the progress of the rescue operation, the rover's own cameras were used to film the wheels. And finally, the efforts paid off. On the 483rd day of the mission, Opportunity managed to get out of this trap and was able to continue moving forward. The scientists also decided that the rover should study the tracks it left behind after the rescue operation. The rover spent 12 days on this. Thus, the rover continued its journey, tirelessly uncovering the mysteries of the Red Planet. I wonder what amazing things will we discover next? We will definitely tell you about this in the next video. And finally, we invite you to enjoy the sounds recorded by NASA.
Extinct volcanoes, canyons, changing seasons, a thin layer of atmosphere. All of this sounds very intriguing. Research on Mars continues to this day. Humanity wants to lift the veil of mystery from the fourth planet of the solar system.
There are currently 8 spacecraft in orbit around Mars, and special rovers, or in other words, Mars rovers, are collecting data directly on the surface. These include Curiosity and Perseverance, which have been operating since 2012 and 2021, respectively, as well as a spacecraft called InSight, which began its mission in 2018. Thanks to the data we've received from spacecraft operating both on the surface and in orbit, we now know a bit more about Mars's past. For example, that the planet once had milder conditions and higher humidity. What kinds of landscapes could we have observed on Mars in the past, and what is happening there now? Research probes will tell us about this. Let's start with the Mars Odyssey orbiter. It began its mission back in 2001 and is still active today. During this time, Odyssey has completed over 94,000 orbits around Mars. Thanks to this spacecraft, we know what landforms exist on the surface, as well as the presence of minerals there. What became especially interesting for us was the fact that there are areas with ice on Mars, but they are located in a part of the planet where, in principle, this would be highly unlikely. Mars Odyssey continues its work, and we will surely receive a lot more new data from it. And this is the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter, or MRO for short. One of its main tasks is to study the surface, while also searching for areas of the planet where it would be convenient to land a research probe. For this reason, we have many interesting images taken by the MRO's camera. The most remarkable of them is a photo of sand dunes. You can notice that a layer of frost has formed on the surface. As you remember earlier, we mentioned that Mars has changing seasons. When winter comes to the planet, a lot of changes happen on the surface. Of course, there are no blizzards raging on Mars, and there aren't endless snowfalls, even though it's quite cold there, minus 123 degrees Celsius at the poles. Nevertheless, at this time of year on Mars, you can actually find not just ordinary snow, but 2 different kinds. One is water snow, the other is dry, made of carbon dioxide. And of course, there are snowflakes on Mars, and they have rather unusual shapes. What do water snowflakes on Earth look like? They are hexagonal because snowflakes have a crystalline structure, and the symmetry of such structures is hexagonal, that is, 6-sided. But on Mars, snowflakes made of dry ice are cube-shaped, meaning they have 4-sided symmetry. Martian snowflakes are very small. They are hardly visible to the naked eye. Snow does not appear all over the surface of Mars, mostly at the poles, that is, in the coldest areas. And in most cases, snow accumulates on the slopes of highlands or in the craters of extinct volcanoes. However, in most cases, water snow doesn't even have time to reach the surface of Mars and turns into gas. It's all about the atmosphere. It's very thin. Since we're already talking about the atmosphere of Mars, the MAVEN spacecraft is studying it to track how it has changed over different periods of time and why. And the reason the atmosphere is becoming thinner and thinner is the solar wind. The planet gradually cooled down, and with that, the shielding effect of the global magnetic field weakened. So what happens on Mars when spring comes? The process of melting Martian ice begins, and some rather interesting ice formations are created. In spring, geysers also start to erupt. Not only orbital probes can tell us about Mars, but also rovers, which have been carrying out their missions for several years now. And we'll start with the nuclear-powered rover Perseverance, or as it's also called, Percy. It's one of the youngest rovers, which landed on the surface of Mars on February 18, 2021. For a long time, Perseverance has been exploring the Jezero impact crater. The main goal of the rover's mission is to understand what changes occurred on the surface of Mars in the early periods of time, as well as to find traces of microbial organisms. Thanks to Perseverance, we have obtained samples of the Martian atmosphere and regolith, as well as a huge number of photographs of the terrain formations on the red planet. Their number reaches 166,000. Here are some of them. The spacecraft Insight. It survived the most powerful storms. But despite this, it continues to faithfully carry out its mission. The lander recorded a Martian earthquake of enormous magnitude. Moreover, it became the strongest one of all those we know about on Mars. Some of its tremors could still be felt even 10 hours after the earthquake. Insight managed to detect the tremors, even though the presumed epicenter of the earthquake is located 2,000 kilometers away from it. In general, it's worth mentioning that Mars has quite high seismic activity. During InSight's stay there, several hundred series of tremors were recorded. The study of Martian earthquakes will continue since such phenomena help us learn more about the terrain of Mars. And finally, the rover Curiosity. He has faithfully served space science since 2012. Fresh data from him comes in frequently. He pays special attention to the clouds of Mars. For example, Curiosity managed to notice how, during sunset, rays of the sun shone through clouds that were higher than the others. These are truly unique shots. Apparently, these clouds are made of dry ice and carbon dioxide, while the other clouds are made of water ice. Because the crystals in the clouds change size over time, we can observe something similar to a rainbow. As the saying goes, it's not all about clouds. Curiosity also found traces of lakes that might have once existed on Mars. The rovers are exploring Mount Sharp, which is located in Gale Crater. It is believed that there was once a lake in this crater. Water flowed into it from Martian rivers, but over time it dried up. At the moment, Curiosity is exploring the sulfate-bearing unit of Mount Sharp. Back in 2016, the rover also discovered a metallic meteorite there, which was mainly composed of iron and nickel. The peculiarity of this object is that it was most likely previously melted. The meteorite was named Egrok because of its rounded shape and unusually smooth surface. Sometimes it seems to us that we know everything about the planets of the solar system. However, in reality, this is just an illusion. There are so many mysteries and secrets around us, and Mars is no exception here. It still hasn't revealed much to us, and perhaps there is much about its past that we may never learn. However, our research probes are not wasting any time and are doing everything possible to uncover the mysteries of the red planet's past. And which of the discoveries made by the probes and rovers interested you the most? And what do you think we will learn next? What will we find out about Mars in the near future? NASA is the killer of Martian life. What do you think about such a statement? It sounds like something unreal, like another conspiracy theory. However, part of the scientific community believes in this version. There aren't that many supporters of it, but the main thing is that they exist. Such thoughts seem extremely illogical. After all, NASA's spacecraft that operate on other planets are specially treated so that they can't somehow interfere with extraterrestrial processes. NASA pays special attention to Mars, since the idea that life once existed there or still exists to this day has never left our minds. But what if it was actually NASA that contributed to the disappearance of life on Mars? And how did they do it? We don't have any evidence yet that there were or are living organisms on Mars. But what if we once discovered these signs but couldn't understand what they were and just ignored them as if they were trash? Let's go back in time. In 1975, NASA launched the Viking space program to study Mars. The Viking 1 and Viking 2 spacecraft were the first to land on the red planet and gave us photographs of the Martian surface. The Viking mission spacecraft had special instruments that were supposed to detect possible living organisms there. The Vikings remain the only spacecraft to have had such a wide array of instruments. And here's the most interesting part. 2 experiments detected signs of metabolism in some samples of Martian soil. Other experiments also found signs of metabolism, however. During the experiments, no traces of organic compounds were detected, which is very important. The Vikings found a small amount of chlorine, but at the time this wasn't given much importance, since astronomers thought it was residue from the material used to treat the spacecraft. Overall, the Viking mission did not find any signs of life forms on the red planet, according to scientists. However, the opinion on this issue was not unanimous. The main criticisms were directed at the way the experiment was conducted. Let's take a closer look at how the experiment to detect metabolism was conducted. Soil samples from the red planet were placed in a special solution with the radioactive isotope carbon-14. If there were any microorganisms in the soil, a metabolic reaction would occur. Before the mission began, this method was tested using soil from different parts of the Earth, and in all cases, the experiment showed the presence of microorganisms. To make sure the experiment would be accurate, they tested samples of soil from the Moon, and here, the result was predictably negative. So there were no mistakes, but at the same time, on Mars, the result was positive. The most interesting thing is that this result was obtained by 2 different devices located in different places. At first, there was a theory that this result was obtained because the soil samples were affected by ultraviolet rays. The scientists took samples that had not been exposed to ultraviolet light, and again, the result was positive. When the samples were specifically heated to 160 degrees, the result was already negative. Metabolism weakened significantly when the temperature reached 50 degrees. When the samples were placed for a long time in an environment with a temperature of 10 degrees, the result became completely negative. In the end, the scientists concluded that there is no life on Mars after all, and that there is another explanation for such curious experimental results. However, there are still supporters of the theory that back then Viking 1 and Viking 2 really did manage to detect signs of life and that the scientists simply misinterpreted the results. As we mentioned earlier, no organic compounds were found during the experiments. There are several explanations for why this happened. The first and most obvious explanation is that there are no organic compounds there. The second explanation is that the experiment for detecting organic compounds was not perfect, which means its results were distorted. The third explanation is that organics were simply not detected because they were destroyed during the process of heating the soil samples. And some scientists believe that water was actually to blame, since water was used in all of the experiments. The point is that water supposedly shouldn't have been added. It's possible that microorganisms on Mars have adapted to life without water. If you start watering them, they'll just die, unable to quickly adapt to the new living conditions. It's somewhat similar to organisms found in Earth's deserts, which get some moisture just from the air. However, there hasn't been any comprehensive scientific work written on this issue, so the opinion of most scientists hasn't changed. But they're called NASA killers not because they methodically destroyed life on Mars like maniacs, but because they overlooked it or accidentally eliminated it in the very sample they were analyzing. This whole story tells us that we need to organize new missions to Mars in order to finally get to the truth, especially since Mars continues to be the center of everyone's attention. The red planet still hides many secrets, and the desire to uncover them is only fueled by specialists from NASA. In September 2023, the space agency released a new audio recording from Mars. This time, these are the sounds produced by MOXIE, a special device installed on the Perseverance rover. We are making tremendous efforts to detect signs of extraterrestrial life, even in its most primitive form. However, what if this extraterrestrial life has already come to us? For example, in September of this year, alien bodies were brought directly to the Mexican parliament. In general, Mexico is more progressive on this issue. They are already discussing such things at the official level. It all started with the journalist Jaime Maussan, who is also a staunch supporter of the existence of UFOs. And he stated that the discovered mummy remains are representatives of an extraterrestrial civilization that came to Earth more than 1,000 years ago. At the parliamentary hearing, they brought in 2 alleged alien bodies. And to make it even more convincing, they added video footage of unexplained anomalous phenomena. The aliens themselves were small in size, had elongated heads, and 3 fingers on each hand. According to Jaime Maussan, the bodies were found near the ancient Nazca lines in the southern part of Peru. How did NASA react to this? Scientists requested the bodies for research in order to find out the truth for sure. Both David Spergel, who once led an independent NASA investigation regarding UFOs, and Dan Evans, assistant to NASA's deputy administrator, spoke about this. And Maussan, meanwhile, still hasn't provided the bodies. If we look deeper into Jaime Maussan's biography, we'll find that he has already once claimed to have discovered alien remains in Peru. That was in 2017, however, it turned out that they were just dolls. And now, once again, there are alien remains, but this time in the Mexican parliament. Julieta Fierro, a researcher at the Institute of Astronomy of the National Autonomous University of Mexico, was one of the most ardent skeptics in this case. Here's what she told journalists. Maussan says that he talked with the Virgin of Guadalupe. He told me that aliens don't talk to me the way they talk to him because I don't believe in them. Well, this person is clearly eccentric, but maybe he's actually telling the truth? There are a lot of oddities in this story, like, for example, why the remains were so easily taken out of Peru, where they were supposedly discovered. Since these are such valuable objects that could change our understanding of history and science, and the most interesting thing is that there were no representatives from Peru at the presentation in the Mexican parliament, which makes it even stranger. After all, it would be strange if the country didn't want to get a share of the glory. Later, it turned out that not a single Peruvian scientific institution found any evidence during the examination of the remains that they were extraterrestrial beings. You also have to take into account that some of the DNA can't be identified at all. Most likely, that's because of the age of the objects. Maussan didn't give up. As proof, he provided the results of radiocarbon analysis, which supposedly indicated the great age of the objects. Moreover, the laboratory itself says that they never saw the alien bodies and only conducted research on a small sample. And again, we can't speak about the accuracy of the results, because in theory, the biology of aliens is different from ours, which is quite logical. In the end, it turns out that this case is just another fantasy of Maussan, which simply managed to reach such a high level. So we still haven't found any signs of life on other planets, just as extraterrestrial life has never come to Earth. However, science is advancing by leaps and bounds, and who knows, maybe someday we will finally receive news about alien organisms in some galaxy. And what do you think? How soon will that happen? Or maybe representatives of extraterrestrial civilizations will visit us someday.